Today, we're going to talk about the Washington and Adams administrations, which is really another way of saying, how do you build a national government from scratch without accidentally recreating the British Empire you just finished fighting? The founders had won independence, written a constitution, and then discovered an inconvenient truth. Now they actually had to run the country. And it turns out that writing about liberty is much easier than governing a restless population, managing debt, dealing with European powers, and trying not to tear the Constitution in half in the process. At the center of these struggles were George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, men who agreed on the importance of liberty, but deeply disagreed on how best to preserve it. When George Washington took office in 1789, everything he did set a precedent. There were no rules, no traditions, well, this is how we've always done it. Washington understood that the presidency had to be strong enough to function, but not so strong that it frightened the public. As he put it, the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. The great challenge of his administration was defining the proper role of the federal government, and nowhere did that challenge become clearer than inside his own cabinet. Washington's cabinet quickly divided into two camps. On one side was Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, who believed the survival of the nation depended on a strong central government, a sound financial system, close economic ties with Britain. On the other side was Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, supported by James Madison, who believed liberty depended on limited federal power, strict adherence to the Constitution. An agrarian republic of independent citizens, Jefferson warned that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. He feared Hamilton's system would create an aristocracy of bankers and speculators, men who lived off government power rather than honest labor. This philosophical divide exploded into open conflict over economic policy. Hamilton's proposal for a Bank of the United States sparked the first major constitutional debate. Hamilton argued that the bank was necessary and proper to carry out Congress's financial responsibilities. Jefferson responded that necessity was being dangerously redefined. Jefferson warned Washington that allowing implied powers would mean the Constitution would no longer limit the government at all. As he wrote, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power. Washington ultimately sided with Hamilton and signed the bank bill, but Jefferson and Madison took note. This was not just about a bank. It was about whether the Constitution restrained power or merely suggested it. That tension intensified in 1794 with the Whiskey Rebellion. The federal government imposed an excise tax on whiskey, an unpopular move among Western farmers who used whiskey as currency. Resistance escalated into violence, and Washington responded by personally leading troops to suppress the rebellion. Now, Washington was constitutionally justified. But Jefferson and Madison saw a troubling precedent: federal authority enforced by military force against its own citizens. Jefferson worried the new government was beginning to look less like a republic and more like what Americans had just escaped. Liberty, he believed, was fragile, and power, once exercised, rarely volunteered to shrink. If the bank and whiskey tax caused concern, the Jay Treaty of 1794 caused outrage. Negotiated with Great Britain, the treaty avoided war and stabilized trade, but it also appeared to favor Britain at the expense of America's revolutionary ally, France. Jefferson saw the treaty as a betrayal of Republican principles. He believed it bound America economically and politically to the very empire it had fought to escape. Public reaction was explosive. John Jay was burned in effigy across the country. Jefferson and Madison concluded that organized political opposition was no longer optional, it was necessary. Despite Washington's warnings against factions, political parties emerged because ideas mattered, and power demanded opposition. Jefferson and Madison organized what became the Republican Party, dedicated to limited government, states' rights, strict constitutional interpretation, protection of civil liberties. Jefferson believed parties were the only defense against consolidation of power, or as he once wrote, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. When John Adams became president in 1797, he inherited a divided nation and a brewing foreign crisis. Adams was a patriot and a revolutionary, but he lacked Washington's unifying presence. Worse still, he faced growing tensions with France. France, angered by the Jay Treaty, began seizing American ships. This led to the Quasi War, an undeclared naval conflict. Federalists pushed for war and expanded federal power. Jefferson and Madison feared this would destroy the Republic. Their worst fears seemed confirmed with the Alien and Sedition Acts, which criminalized criticism of the government. Jefferson was appalled. He warned that our liberty depends on the freedom of the press and that cannot be limited without being lost. In response, Jefferson and Madison authored the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, asserting that states could resist unconstitutional federal laws. By the election of 1800, the lines were drawn. Federalists favored order, hierarchy, and centralized power. Republicans championed liberty, local control, and constitutional limits. Jefferson's victory marked what he called the Revolution of 1800, not a violent upheaval, but a peaceful correction. The Washington and Adams administrations taught Americans a vital lesson. Liberty requires vigilance, opposition, and limits on power. And if you admire Jefferson, as I do, you see in this period the birth of a political tradition that still asks the most important question in American history: how much power is too much? Next time, we'll examine what happens when Jefferson himself takes office and discovers that resisting power is much easier than wielding it.